Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted, and today's topic is the second half of our discussion on the lower colonies. Now, as always, take a moment, hit pause on this video, jot down the rest of the lecture outline, and make sure you have those key terms at the top. With that, let's get started. Now, we left off, we were discussing this process, this evolution of the labor system of Virginia, and discussing about the ideas of how race became the determining factor. And we last part of it was talking about what indentured servants were. Now, as I mentioned though, despite the harsh conditions, 75% of the people that came to the Chesapeake were indentured servants because they had this ultimate vision, this hope of obtaining land. However, there were some problems here. There were some problems with this whole indentured servitude plan. You see, in the 1620s, most of the indentured servants were actually kind of being voluntold to come to the New World. In other words, you're kind of rounding them up in England saying you're going or else. But by the 1630s, people were volunteering by the boatloads to be indentured servants. This is because tobacco prices were climbing and the economy in England was, well, in a little bit of a recession. But that poses a problem. Because what happens is, when you get to Virginia, and you start growing tobacco, and you survive your contract. Remember, every year that goes by, every decade that goes by, people are living longer and better mortality rate in colonial Virginia. People are starting to figure out, don't drink that water. Most people, at least. And so the problem is, when you get those freedom dues, you're promised 50 acres, which not only does that pose a problem with Native Americans because you're taking their land to get that 50 acres. I mean, heaven forbid I give you my land. Think about this for a minute. You're an indentured servant. You survive your contract. You're ticked off at your former master because, well, they treat you like crap. Your former master now gives you 50 acres. What are you going to grow? Well, A, you want to stick it to your former boss, and B, you're going to grow the one thing that A, you know makes money, and B, the thing that you know how to grow, tobacco. Which means every time a master frees an indentured servant, they are creating a new economic competitor, which is flooding the market with more and more tobacco. And I know you all know economics. What happens when you flood the market with a huge amount of supply? The price plummets. And that's what started happening by the 1660s. By the time of the 1660s, the price of tobacco across the world the bottom has fallen out. So who gets hurt the worst here? Well, if you're a person who has, 500 acres growing tobacco, you can afford to take the downward spiral of the price of tobacco because you can still deliver high quantity. But if you're a newly freed indentured servant who doesn't have the ability to purchase more indentured servants or slaves or anyone else, and you only have 50 acres to work on, are you going to be able to compete as a small landowner against the big boys? Especially in a downturn economy. Now, if the economy was good, you all can make money. But in the downturn economy, thanks to the price of tobacco plummeting, you can't survive. And therefore, all that promise, all that hope, all that work that you survived as an indentured servant is now for naught. You are now in a poor condition, despite the fact you are a landowner. Well, prices plummet. There's new economic crisis in colonial Virginia. And when in times of economic turmoil, who do you blame? Your local officials, right? Who's in charge of your area? In this case, they blame the governor, whose name is William Berkeley. Now, you see him picture top right. Now, William Berkeley, he was appointed the governor by the king in 1641. And he was, of course, this was a prosperous time, and he was still the governor during the economic downturn. So he's going to receive the blame because he's the leader. And by the 1660s, 1670s, these common planters are begging for relief, tax relief, help, do something to help the markets. And by the 1670s, they're pleading for lower taxes. And the governor says, no. These newly freed, recently freed indentured servants are pleading with Governor Berkeley for access to better quality land by taking it from Native Americans. William Berkeley says, no. Enter Nathaniel Bacon. Now, Nathaniel Bacon, picture top left, he was a recent arrival to Virginia. He was 29 years old, he was charismatic, he was wealthy, and he was well connected to the wealthy people of England. Well, he arrives to the Chesapeake, and these newly freed common planter and former indentured servants rally to him because he says he can help. He's an elite, he despises Governor William Berkeley, and he becomes a leader of the common planter. Well, in 1676, Bacon has a plan to help the common planter, and he organizes all the local planters, the common ones, the lower class ones, and he organizes an attack on Native Americans. This becomes known as Bacon's Rebellion. So in summer 1676, Bacon's ready to go lead his men out to attack Indians and get more land. Remember, whenever you want land, you steal from the Indians. Well, in response to this, Governor William Berkeley charges Bacon with treason. So Bacon says, wait, seriously? I'm trying to help the people, and you want to charge me with treason, which, by the way, the punishment is death. And so in September of 1676, Bacon and his men turn around from going to attack Indians and march back into Jamestown to take on Governor William Berkeley. Now, as he begins to march his mob into Jamestown, William Berkeley sees the mob coming and runs out the back door. And Bacon decides to set Jamestown on fire and kind of install himself as kind of the unofficial leader now of Jamestown. That's September 1676. The following month, as an unofficial leader of Jamestown, Bacon decides that he'll sit down and have some drinks. Now, what I mean by drinks, I mean the water of Jamestown, which, as we know from history, it's polluted. Guys, this is why you should learn history. You don't want it to repeat itself. And sure enough, Nathaniel Bacon drank the tainted water of Jamestown and promptly died. The rebels now are without a leader, and they have no idea what to do. Well, William Berkeley does, though. He's well connected still. He sends a letter to the king, tells him all about the rebellion, and the king sends thousands of troops to Jamestown who will arrive in December of 1676 and restore order. And again, it's pretty easy to do because Bacon's dead. And to discourage further outbreaks, troops begin to execute those involved in the rebellion. And by January 1677, the rebellion's over. And for his part, though, Governor Berkeley receives a lot of blame for not dealing with it better, and he'll be removed from Virginia. Now, before we go on here, this situation is in theory about indentured servitude. And in fact, by the 1660s, 1670s, if you're an indentured servant, the odds are you will live out your term and get your freedom dues. Because again, the mortality rate is improving in Virginia. However, you will get your freedom dues, but you will not make money. And so you start sending letters back to Old England saying, hey, do not come to Virginia. It's not worth the 4 to 7 year contract. You're going to make no money. And so by the 1660s, 1670s, by the time Bacon's Rebellion is done, indentured servants disappear as a viable labor option, which means you need to find a new labor source once again. And this is where I want to take a little divergent talk for a second here. Bacon's Rebellion, yes, signals this issue, this change in labor systems. It signals the end of indentured servitude as a viable option in colonial Virginia. But it also has one more profound impact. It's what some historians have termed the invention of black and white. In fact, a legal scholar by the name of Michelle Alexander wrote, "The events of Jamestown were alarming to the planter elite, who were deeply fearful of a multiracial alliance between indentured servants and the few slaves who were already there. Word of Bacon's rebellion spread far and wide, and there would be several more similar uprisings. In an effort to protect their superior status and economic positions, the planters shifted their strategy for maintaining dominance. They abandoned their heavy reliance on indentured servants in favor of the importation of black slaves. Let me put it a different way for you. After Bacon's rebellion, Virginia lawmakers, remember those Virginia slave laws that really began to kick up in the 1670s, 1680s? They began to make legal distinctions between black and white. Remember, if you marry a person of a different race, you'll be banished from the colony? Yeah, that one. Now, it was not that people didn't see color before that. In fact, back in 1617, the Oxford Dictionary had first printed the adjectives white to reference a white man who has a light complexion. And, so there was this distinction that, there's a white person. The concept was there, but no one really saw themselves in that light. Remember, what mattered was your wealth, do you have land, etc. But following Bacon's rebellion, we start seeing heavily the decreased dissension of how Africans were treated in society compared with white indentured servants. In fact, in their effort to make this distinction and avoid a white indentured servant, black enslaved individuals, a coalition forming to fight against the planter elite. Remember, these elite large-scale plantation owners want to maintain their economic superiority and their superior social position. And the worst thing that could happen to them would be for these poor whites and enslaved Africans to join together to fight against them because they outnumber them. And so to prevent that, they begin to decrease the status of Africans by passing laws that made them racially lower. At the same time, they begin to give new rights and statuses to indentured servants that cause the word white to be more widely used in both public and private documents. So in all legal documents, in newspapers, and elsewhere, the terms black and white began to have legal definitions of superiority, inferiority. Blacks were seeing their rights decrease. Remember Anthony Johnson? He's losing his right to vote, his right to carry firearms, paying higher taxes. At the same time, even poor whites, despite being poor, were giving more rights. They were giving tax breaks. They were giving more freedoms and as a conscious effort by the planter class to drive a wedge between laborers who theoretically should work together. As you see the quote on the top right, many of the European descended poor whites began to identify themselves, if not directly with the rich whites, certainly with being white. So even if they didn't say, well, we're equal now with the rich, they at least said, well, we're not black. And it's here that you get the emergence of the idea of a white race as a way to distinguish themselves from those dark-skinned people who they associated with perpetual slavery. And thus we get the beginning of real racism in the American colonies. And you see in the bottom right corner, it's a simple definition of racism. It's not just individual psychology or pathology, but it's patterns of cultural representation deeply ingrained within the practices, discourses, and subjectivities of Western societies. In other words, yes, it might just be a few people here and there originally, but by putting it into law, by giving black people fewer rights and white people more rights, even though they're both poor, it is ingraining a practice and discourse in their society that will create a foundation for, well, generations, where whites, despite being poor, are up here and blacks are down here. And we saw it with the evolution of the Virginia slave laws. We see it here at the end of Bacon's Rebellion. We see why. And therefore, by the time we get to the 1680s, 1690s, indentured servants were out. They are no longer a viable labor source. By this point, we have increased better transportation capabilities, and therefore slaves are cheaper. There are more supply of enslaved Africans coming across the Atlantic, and the odds are they're going to live because the mortality rate has dropped drastically in colonial Virginia. And thus we see a huge shift from indentured servants to enslaved Africans. So back to my chart I showed you a little while ago. In 1640, 1660, 3% of the population. But by 1700, in just 30 years, we go from 6% to 38%. Look at that. Between 1660 and 1700, more than a 16-fold increase. That's a drastic number change. And of course, they're being viewed as lower. This is perpetual slavery. This is perpetual enslavement. And so in this case, for just a little bit more money than you pay in the cost of transportation across the ocean of an indentured servant, you can now get an enslaved African for life. Slavery becomes hereditary. Now, most Africans are coming from Africa, obviously. Some from the West Indies and the Caribbean, who were already enslaved there. In the shift from indentured servants to African labor, whites began to protect this institution of slavery. Think about this for a minute. They are protecting this institution at all costs. They're protecting that investment. They paid good money and they don't want something to happen to their enslaved individuals. Foremen will be given weapons to monitor their behavior day and night. There will be no opportunity for them to buy or earn their freedom like Anthony Johnson did. In fact, and while they're there, they will receive less food than even indentured servants who were already given the bare minimum. They will receive, as enslaved individuals, less clothing, more minimal housing. They will work longer hours. Remember, indentured servants receive far more. And remember, their existence was pretty crappy, but slaves are treated even worse. But here's the other problem. How do you punish an enslaved African? Remember, if you were an indentured servant and you ran away, we're going to add a year or two. If you stole a hog, we add 2 years. If you're a female, we'll add 2 years if you get pregnant. We can punish you by adding more time to your contract. How do you punish an enslaved individual? You can't add more time. They're already serving a life sentence. And therefore, you begin to use physical violence. You whip them. You beat them. If you run away, no, we're not going to kill them because that would be, wasting our investment. You can remove limbs because you don't need, all 5 fingers to do work in the tobacco fields. 3's fine. Get rid of a couple of them. Or if you've ever seen the old movie called Misery, there's something called hobbling. Now, it's a little grotesque, so I don't show you a visual on my screen. But what happens is you kind of strap the slave down. You spread their ankles out a good distance apart, and you put a block of wood in between their ankles so they doesn't move. Then you take a sledgehammer and you break their ankle over that board. Now, you break both ankles. They're going to heal after 4 to 6 weeks, but they're going to walk with a limp for their ever after. They can still work just fine. A little bit slower, they'll still work just fine. But they're not going to be running away anymore. You're able to punish them. If you have a foul tongue where you talk back to your master, well, cut your tongue out. You don't need your tongue to work, and you'll still live just fine. In other words, owners who enslaved Africans, they didn't treat Africans as human. They treated them as property. They treated them actually very worse than they would treat a horse or a cow. And they did everything in their power to separate this idea of white and black. They wanted to create this wedge between the races because the last thing they want is enslaved Africans to join with poor whites. You realize they're both pretty much living the same way as far as economic standing because they want to maintain their power, their superiority, their social status, their wealth. And so not only are they beating enslaved individuals, they're also figuring out ways to physically separate them in society between poor, white and black. For example, the law on interracial relationships. So one law, specifically in Virginia, it criminalized any interracial relationship. So for instance, a white male who married a non-slave black female would face 6 months in prison. Okay, that doesn't sound too terrible. But if you're a white female and you marry an African male, the white female gets 5 years in prison. Why? Why? First of all, it's just sexism, obviously. It's sexist. But why is it such a different penalty for men and women? The white male gets 6 months. The white female gets 5 years for crossing the race line. Well, the reason is, the justification theoretically was, boys will be boys, right? Men have urges, they have needs, they gave in to their needs. But for a woman who was supposedly this harbinger of virtue and morality, to debase herself and give herself willingly to a black man was considered the ultimate betrayal, hence 5 years. And if, mind you, if the relationship produced a child, the child would serve 31 years in prison or be sent to work for someone else just because they were born. Now, that was the punishment for whites, right? There was no protection for African slave women. If whites raped an enslaved African female, the man did not get in trouble whatsoever because it was his property. And she was his property. Again, this is a conscious attempt to drive a wedge between whites and blacks. As you can see, by the time we get to the 1700s, race becomes the determining factor in society. And by the end of the 17th century, whiteness equates freedom, blackness equates enslavement. It wasn't overnight. It was a process over 50 years. It took several decades. It was the evolution of the labor system, based much on the economy, but we produced a social system that saw whiteness equal freedom, blackness equal enslavement. And this will only continue as we head further south into what become the lower colonies, because there are some territories and colonies further south than in Virginia. And sure enough, in the late 1600s, 1670, another colony is established to the south, named the Carolinas. And these lower colonies, which will encompass North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia ultimately, they will develop very differently than the Chesapeake. Now, when South Carolina is formed, the Carolinas are formed, the vast majority of individuals are wealthy white colonists going to Carolinas. They're coming from the West Indies. And therefore, as they're coming, A, they're wealthy. B, they're already used to plantation-style living of the sugarcane fields of the Caribbean. And they're bringing their race ideologies with them. In other words, they will start out as slave colonies. So they will bring with them enslaved individuals and install it in the Carolinas immediately. There's no evolution there. The problem with the Carolinas is they needed a cash crop. Now, they don't want to grow tobacco because, well, the situation we've already discussed, the market has already bottomed out. So you don't grow tobacco in the Carolinas. You also can't grow sugarcane because it doesn't grow well in the Carolinas. That's a Caribbean crop. And so by the 1690s, they developed two cash crops that grow very well in the swampy coasts of the Carolinas. The first one is rice. Yeah, I know, surprising, right? The American colonies, the United States likes rice? Yes, rice became a huge cash crop. And the second one was indigo. Now, you know what indigo is? It's a dark blue dye, almost a purple. And it was considered the color of royalty. Royal families paid huge money to have indigo dyed, fabrics, curtains, clothing, etc. And so this became a cash crop because everyone wants to be like royalty, especially those wealthy landowners. And so we see over the course of the early 1700s, we see a tremendous increase in both rice exports from 1700 to 1740. Again, by 1740, rice grains small, 43 million pounds per year. And indigo, a little bit later, but 500,000 pounds a year by 1760. And as you can see also, look at the population, the enslaved population. As the increase in white population, yes, but as the increase in the exporting of cash crops, the production of cash crops, by the time we get to 1730, 2/3 of the population is enslaved. Think about that for a minute. The Carolinas are a majority African territory. However, the Africans are enslaved. Because both rice and indigo require lots of labor, enslavement is what was needed, at least according to their mindset. There's still one more, however, colony to talk about, and that's the colony to the south of the Carolinas, known as Georgia. Now, the thing is, the Carolinas were making a lot of money off of enslaved labor. And they decide they want to do something to protect their wealth. You see, the problem is a lot of enslaved individuals, well, didn't like being enslaved. Go figure. And so many of them tried, to turn their back on their white masters and run away. And specifically in the Carolinas, the place to go was Florida. Because Florida was owned by, let me go back to my map real quick here. Florida, as you see, is owned by the Spanish. Now, the Spanish had slavery also. So why would enslaved Carolinas Africans want to go to Florida? Well, basically, the Spanish just wanted to jerk around with the English and said, hey, you English enslaved Africans, you make it to Florida, we'll set you free. And quite often they did, but just jerk around and tick off the English. And so many wealthy landowners in Carolina decided that they wanted to create a buffer zone. And so they wanted to carve out this territory between South Carolina, what is now South Carolina, and Florida. And they wanted to create this as an all-white zone, no slaves allowed. That way, if you saw an African in Georgia, you knew they were a runaway. So it was a buffer colony, a protection thing, right? And so they named the colony of Georgia after King George, because why not name after him? So Georgia. And they set it up as a buffer zone. Now they had to make money there, of course, so they began to grow crops as well. And they would use convicts from England, or other colonies, but mostly from England, to do the labor. And they also began growing rice and indigo. However, by the 1750s, they were getting tired of using convict whites to do the labor. As you can see from the chart, by 1750, they began to petition King George to allow the enslavement of Africans in Georgia as well. And he's like, but didn't you say we wanted no Africans there because this is a buffer zone? And they said, yeah, we said that, but never mind. We need the enslavement of Africans to do our labor force because, well, they just do a better job than prisoners do. And so, under constant pressure, England will finally lift the ban on slavery, and in 1752, England will allow the enslavement of Africans to occur in Georgia. And so by 1752, the entire colonies have been established now. And while all will buy into this idea of the enslavement of Africans, Virginia, Carolinas, Georgia heavily rely on the enslavement of labor of enslaved individuals. And you see this complete racial ideology, this racial hierarchy established that says if you're white, you are free. If you are black, you are enslaved. And thus we've established the original colonies. Now, when we come back next time, we'll discuss what happens next. Because the story to this point has been, hey, this is how we establish our colonies, right? This has been the story from lecture 1 to now, is the story of the establishment of the colonies. What we begin next, the next kind of series in our lectures, is going to be beginning, how do we get from here, where everyone loves being British and making money, to revolution? How do we develop an American identity? That's the story for next time. So until then, take care and bye-bye.